understand the position. I don't understand how anybody can cry that it's voter suppression. I don't understand that whatsoever. And by the way, I applaud earlier tonight the more creative ways that people are finding to address that issue in helping everybody get whatever they need to carry it out. I can't imagine thinking Americans being concerned about individuals, but it's a problem that people really in this day and time want to push back upon. Yes, sir.
The other thing too with the mass killings that's been a common denominator has been the heavy use of psychotropic drugs on behalf of a lot of these folks too. For whatever that is, you never hear the media talking that.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Question. Try to frame this. When I look back at the party, I am a Republican. I look back at the party and a lot of the fracturing that's happening in it with the grassroots and the leadership of the party. Ted Cruz, you mentioned his name earlier, very much grassroots-oriented candidate. You're sounding grassroots to me.
Sure.
You're talking like grassroots candidate that we should all consider. My question then would be, when I look back at Tampa and how this all began, and I look back at North Carolina's delegation in particular, the former chairman, Robin Hayes, heavy-handed, hardcore, the grassroots, and sprayed Roundup on them. He helped Mitt Romney, heavy hand, the RNC, heavy hand, their rules down everybody's throats in what was, many people argue, fraudulent convention that went down there. And I wonder, with his stand with regard not only that, but when the delegation cast their votes from North Carolina state statute orders how we're supposed to cast our votes. Both parties, Republican and Democrat, are under state statute rule with how our delegates cast their votes, locking them into our primary. The leadership of our party chose to disregard that and take people's votes and cast them instead for Mitt Romney in an effort to make sure that there would not be a broker convention in Tampa. They did this in violation of state law. My question would be, was it your first decision to get into this? And being a grassroots person, why on earth you would choose Robin Hayes as your campaign chair?
Well, first of all, let me just say, I was not a part of that history that you just recounted for us, and I don't know all the ins and outs of that history. So I can't speak educated to that. I can speak to why Robin Hayes, I've asked him to be chair, and why I'm in this race. The marriage amendment became a big piece in my life that brought me, I told you a little bit of my background and the interest that I'd had early on. But it was when the marriage amendment came at the same time I stepped in as president of the Baptist State Convention of North Carolina that I began to see things as I traveled across this state, and I began to hear the outcry for leadership. It was during that time that Tony Perkins of the Family Research Council became a good friend. He called me the day I was elected president of the Baptist State Convention, and he asked me if there was anything he could ever do to help, to please let him know. He wanted to be a part of moving that marriage amendment forward. Tony got involved in that. He brought the Heritage bus here that traveled across the state. They registered voters. He preached in my pulpit for me at First Baptist Church, Charlotte. When the marriage amendment passed in May, he invited me to come to Watchmen on the Wall and speak in Washington, D.C. back in May of 2012, which I did. I was so impressed with what I saw there and the individuals that were part of that I leaned over one night at dinner and I said, look, I'm just sitting here thinking that every pastor in North Carolina needs to experience what I'm experiencing here. And I want to know, do you ever do this regionally? He said, rarely, but on occasion we do. And I said, well, if you'll bring this to North Carolina, I said, we'll cover the overhead. You can do it at First Baptist Church, Charlotte. We'll bring pastors in from across the state. And I would love for them to have an opportunity to hear this message about being the watchman on the wall and the leaders. And so we did that in August. We had over 300 pastors that came together as a part of that. The next month, we had a I Pledge Sunday there at First Baptist on Sunday night. It was actually a service that was simulcast to 2,000 sites across the country. And FRC set that up. And Tony was there. Rick Santorum spoke at that event. We had Kirk Cameron that came and talked about Monumental. We had folks that were part of that, James Dobson, Franklin Graham, and all of those folks. Well, it was that Sunday, and the reason I remember that event so clearly, because it was that day that I sat down with Tony Perkins, and we began to talk about our nation and where things stood. And he looked at me and he said, Mark, he said, have you ever considered yourself to be a candidate for office? And I said, well, Tony, if I was completely transparent with you, I would have to answer that with a yes and a no. He says, well, that sounds like a politician already. And I said, well, you got to give me a chance to explain. I told him my history that I just explained to you about growing up and about the call to preach. And I said, honestly, I've never looked back, and I've never seen myself as a candidate. I said, but why do you ask? And he said, well, the reason that I ask, he said, there's no question that North Carolina has a very vulnerable U.S. Senator in Kay Hagan. And there's a real opportunity to see her defeated going forward. But the problem is that there's a philosophy across the National Republican Party that has talked about moving away from those social issues, moving away from those things, so that we can become more palatable to independents and Democrats. And he said it's a different type of Republican than you and I are in what we believe. And I said, I understand that. And he said, I wanted, with your work in the marriage amendment, and with 61% of North Carolinians going to the polls and voting for it, that was the last real compass that we had of where the people of this state stood on issues that were that clear cut and that much of a contrast. And he said, we have people that are preparing to run for this office who are far more in that vein of wanting to move to the middle or move to the left. And he said, I just really believe that unless we put up a candidate that is a clear contrast to Kay Hagan, a candidate that can articulate that, a candidate that has the organization across the state to be able to do it, then Kay Hagan is going to end up back in that seat. And he said, I wanted to ask you, as we've talked today, would you consider praying about possibly stepping into that race? Well, that was in September. In October, my mom died, as I mentioned a moment ago. And frankly, she got sick on a Friday and died the next Friday. And so it was completely off my radar. The last 3 months of the year, we were just taking care of my dad and making sure everything was set for him. But in January, I made a commitment, again, as I was called, that we would pray about it. My wife and I prayed about that journey. God made it very clear to us with 3 blocks that there was the personal aspect, that He was going to have to give us clearance. There was the church aspect, as I serve as pastor of First Baptist Church Charlotte, and I didn't know how they were going to react to it. And then there was the political landscape aspect. And we prayed together. We came back together in early February, and we began to share what we were learning during our own personal quiet times, as well as what God was saying to us when we prayed together. And it was very clear from that conversation that we knew 3 things. 1, we were not to close the door. 2, He would make our path straight. And number 3, trust Him. We knew that. Intuitively, I knew that my next step was I had to sit down and talk with people that I considered to be spiritual people, but people who I also knew had a lot more experience in this arena than I had. And as a result of that, I began to meet with folks. I met with Tammy Fitzgerald, who was a part of the leadership with me in the Vote for Marriage NC, who's executive director of the North Carolina Values Coalition. I sat down and met with others along the way. Senator Jim Jackman, who was a former state senator who had served on a board of trustees with me for 10 years at Southeastern Seminary and served 3 terms in the state senate. I sat down with Justice Paul Newby of the North Carolina Supreme Court, and we spent an inordinate amount of time in the Supreme Court building. And I'll never forget that day in that room when he knelt down beside me and we prayed together if this was what God would have me do. And when I left that meeting, Justice Newby said, I want to encourage you to make a phone call. He said, I think you need to sit down with Robin Hayes and you need to share with him what's on your heart. That was on a Thursday. On that Monday, I contacted Robin Hayes. And I simply had met Robin Hayes 3 times in my life. I met him in 1996 when he ran for governor in North Carolina. He took out Richard Vinroot, who was the more moderate Republican running for governor and the mayor of Charlotte at that time. And he came and spoke for me in Clemens, North Carolina. I met him a second time in 2003 when we had a group of 8th graders from a church I was pastoring in Augusta, Georgia, up visiting Washington. And we were walking through the tunnel and we just ran into each other under the Capitol. And we spoke that time. And then the third time was at a Vote for Marriage rally that he had attended and I had attended. And at that meeting, he had handed me his card and he said, if I can ever help you, let me know. That was back in early 2012. Here we are a year later. I've had this advice, I need to call him. I got to a Bible study I lead on Monday morning, and I happened to get there 15 minutes early, and I reached in my day timer. I'm still a dinosaur. I carry an iPhone, but I keep my calendar in this. And I reached in there, and I pulled out a business card that I had saved of him, and I emailed him. And I simply said, Dear Mr. Hayes, this is Mark Harris, pastor of First Baptist Church, Charlotte. If you have any time over the next several weeks or months that I could have an opportunity to sit down with you and share my heart with you, I would love to do so. And I thought, well, I sent it. Sincerely, Mark Harris. I thought, I'll hear from this in 6